Hello and welcome to Lesson 3 of Ecosystems, Biodiversity and Management. This session is going to be looking again at world ecosystems, but we are now going to focus on why they are located where they are. So far in Lesson 1 you covered their location, and this map should hopefully be fairly familiar to you to show the locations of some of the world's major biomes. The second session we looked at what their characteristics were like, so what it would be like if you were in that particular biome, so the climate, the vegetation and the soil type. But today the session is going to measure your deeper understanding. So knowing that this green patch here is where tropical rainforests are located is one thing, but knowing why the tropical rainforests are located in this band along the middle of the earth is another factor. So we're going to look at global factors of latitude and climate, but also local factors which can affect why these biomes are found where they are found. The first thing we're going to do, though, just to measure your understanding from the first two sessions, is there are 7 questions here, the magnificent 7, we like to call them in geography, and if you can answer those 7 questions, then you have understood the content that you've covered so far this topic. If there's any questions there you're not sure about, then that's fine, you can go back over your notes, or you may want to revisit those lessons again. So the 7 questions you can see on the screen there. All I want you to do is just have a go at answering those 7 questions. So pause the screen, have a go, and then I'll go through the answers for you in a second. Okay, so let's go through the answers to these. The word biotic refers to the living parts of an ecosystem. Abiotic refers to the non-living parts of an ecosystem, so the climate, the soil, the ground, the water, the air, etc. Deciduous and temperate forests are different from each other in a few ways. One of the main ways is the type of tree species that dominates. So in deciduous forests they lose their leaves because they're seasonal, whereas boreal forests are evergreen. You could also mention the climate characteristics being different. You could also mention the fact that they are different locations around the world. Another term for the tropical grassland biome is savanna. The 2 biomes that you only find in the northern hemisphere, particularly for our means, it's not quite true, but from our research that we've done so far, tundra and boreal forest. You do get tundra in the southern hemisphere as well, but we won't go into that. It's not a big deal. The degrees north of the equator, the Tropic of Cancer is 23.5 degrees. And the Antarctic Circle is south of the equator by 66.5 degrees. Okay, so hopefully you can answer most of those. Again, just keeping your knowledge topped up all the time is really, really important for most of the questions you'll find in most of the papers. All right, so if you weren't sure about the first 2 questions here, we're just going to recap about biotic and abiotic environments. The biotic is the living environment, so that includes the vegetation and all the mammals, insects, birds, microorganisms, basically everything living. And the mass of all that biotic material is known as the biomass. Okay, and you'll cover that more later when we look at something called Gershmill models. We're going to look in more detail at the biotic environment of 2 biomes later on in this course. So tropical rainforests and temperate deciduous forests we're going to cover in much more detail later on in this topic. The abiotic parts of an ecosystem, the non-living parts, include its chemical and physical components, so things like climate and latitude, soil characteristics, and its relief or altitude, how far away it is from the surface. And in this session we're going to be looking quite a lot more at those abiotic features of biomes. Okay, so this map, again, fairly familiar to you. This is just another version of where the biomes are located. I'm just going to put a new map on the screen, and you're going to see if you can notice the difference between the 2. So watch carefully. Okay, I'll just do it really quickly again. Old map. New map. Now, aside from the fact that the second map is slightly larger, ignore that. What we're really looking for is any similarities between the 2 maps, even though they show different things. You might at first glance think they show the same thing because they're just color-coded maps, but this second map, which is on the screen now, shows the climate zones of the world. So the first map, this shows where those biomes are located, and the second map shows the type of temperature and precipitation you'll find in these areas. And we give those climates different names. So this area here, for example, and here, this sort of light sandy colour, which is appropriately kind of coloured, is where you would find the arid climate zones. Arid means dry, dry responsible for deserts, okay? And this is why you find deserts and scrub in those areas. Sorry, that's a bit slow. The wet areas, or the equatorial areas, are areas next to the equator. That's why we call them equatorial, and they tend to be quite wet, and wet, warm areas near the equator are the perfect conditions for tropical or equatorial rainforests. So this shows you the very clear link between the climate and where you might find global ecosystems. And actually, this is probably the most important factor when it comes to where ecosystems are located around the world. If you had a question that asked you to assess the factors that determine the location of biomes, climate would have to be really your number one factor, or latitude. These are these global factors which really determine where you get your ecosystems. That's why we don't have tropical rainforests in the UK, because, unless you're at the Eden Project under a big dome, because we are not in the right location for the right climate for that to be the case. So our climate is not suitable for tropical rainforests. Now, looking at the maps side by side here, you can see again just how similar they are and just how much they really match up quite well. They don't match up exactly, and there are lots of reasons for that, but generally speaking, the boreal forest and the tundra are where you find your kind of polar climates. The deciduous forests tend to be where you find your temperate, your sort of green climates there. Again, we talked about arid climates and deserts, so they do match up fairly well with some slight differences. Okay, so a nice copy and complete for you to do. So what I'd like you to do is write this out in full, please. All the words that go into the right places are in the yellow boxes at the top, and I've even helped you by providing you with the first letter, how generous we are in geography. So what I'd like to do now is pause the screen, complete this, and then when you're ready, unpause the screen, and I will go through the answers for you. Okay, so I'm going to go through the answers now. Climate is the main factor which influences biomes and their location, and mainly involves temperature and precipitation, or rainfall. Temperature decreases with latitude, so the further north or south you go, as the equator receives the most heat from the sun, whereas the energy decreases further from the equator due to the Earth's curvature. Due to the high temperature at the equator, a convection cell, or a Hadley cell, causes air to rise, cool, condense, and make excessive rainfall. Cooled and very dry air then falls at the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, or Tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. This creates high pressure due to sinking air. As the air sinks, it warms again, so temperature is high, but precipitation is low. That last paragraph, that's covered in more detail in the Weather Hazards and Climate Change unit, because the air movement around the Earth is covered there in much more detail. So if you're struggling to understand that, don't worry about it for now. Just go to the Weather Hazards and Climate Change sessions, and that will hopefully become a bit clearer. Okay, now what I've got this graphic showing you with my nice spinning globe is just to show you the difference between the sun's energy and why the equator is warmer than north or south of the equator. So what we've got here is the sun, this big burning mass to the right, and as the sun's rays, the sun's energy, meet the Earth, at this point, which is fairly central, they actually hit the Earth at a much more concentrated amount. So this would be like a stiletto heel walking in the snow. It's the same energy and the same weight of the person standing in it, but you're going to sink more easily because it's more concentrated. It's got a point. The further north you go, this same amount of energy is actually spread over a slightly larger area, and therefore it's a bit more diluted. So this is you taking off your stiletto heel in the snow and putting on a pair of trainers. You're not going to sink as far into the snow because your weight is more spread. Now, when we're talking about solar radiation, if you've got more concentrated solar radiation at the equator, it means you're going to be hotter. And the further north or south you go, because of this curve and the spread of that solar radiation, it's not as warm. And that's why the UK doesn't have really sort of all year round 30-degree temperatures, whereas at the equator, It pretty much does. So this is one of the main factors that affects the temperature, the climate, but it's linked to the latitude. Okay, so latitude and climate determine how hot and how much sort of solar radiation each place around the world will get. Now this changes according to whether we're in winter or summer. So in the UK, the summer, okay, the summer months, we are actually angled. You can see from this tilt here, we are angled towards the sun. So we actually get slightly more concentrated solar radiation. During our summer in the northern hemisphere, you can see that the southern hemisphere, the bottom half of the Earth, sort of Australia, New Zealand, South America, South Africa, they are actually tilted away from the sun. And therefore, they get far less solar radiation because this same amount here at the bottom is spread out even further. And so that's why they have winter when we have summer. During our winter months, the Earth is still at this angle, but it's the other side of the sun. And so we are actually angled away from the sun, and that's why we get colder weather in winter. But again, all of that is explained in more depth in the Weather Hazards and Climate Change unit. Okay, so how does latitude affect climate? We've just sort of had a bit of an explanation from the diagram I showed you last time, but this is a bit more detailed static sketch that I'd like you to complete really to get that information down. So this diagram shows a few things, and I'd like you to have a little look at it and spend some time looking really carefully. This shows you solar energy. This isn't the sun relative to the Earth because that would be ridiculous. This shows solar energy, and the arrow width tells you that this part of the Earth, the equator, gets the most solar energy, and then the further north or south you go, the less solar energy you get because of this curvature of the Earth. Don't worry too much about these winds, the westerlies, northeast trades. Don't put those onto your diagram. We don't need to know those quite yet. But what I would like you to notice are these arrows. And in between these arrows, what's happening. So this is quite important to realise that if the arrows are going up at this point, you get rain. If the arrows are going down, you get less rain. So this is why you've got wet area, very dry area, wet area, rainforest, very dry area, desert, wet area. Okay? So this diagram should hopefully show you the relationship between the sun's energy, the movement of air, rainfall and less rainfall, and where you find certain biomes. There's lots to take in from this, and that's why I would like you to produce a detailed sketch. Again, pause the screen, do it as long as it takes you to do a really good, clear sketch. Don't worry about taking up space in your book. Make sure it's clear enough for you to see. And there you go. I've just increased the size of it just to make it a little bit clearer, a little bit easier for you to copy. Okay, I'm going to move on now. If you're not ready, please remember, pause the screen, finish that sketch, and then we're going to crack on. So other factors globally, again, we've mentioned some of these, and I can't link this YouTube video while I'm doing a screen recording. So what I would like you to do is just click or type in this YouTube video link, and that will explain to you, with a bit of a cheesy video, I have to say, why the tilt of the Earth affects the difference in seasons, if you needed to have a bit further explanation. Another global factor is whether you are a large landmass or a continent, or you live near the sea, or you're an island. So you can either have continental or maritime climate. The UK has what's called a maritime climate because we're a small island surrounded by water. And that, surprise, surprise, makes us a little bit wetter, but it also means that we can cool down and warm up in a more gentle way, because the sea and the water regulates our temperature nicely. If we were a large landmass, say like the middle of Asia, or maybe the middle of Canada in North America, then our temperature range is more extreme. We cool down much faster and we warm up much slower. Warm up much faster. So the best analogy I can give you is a cup of tea and a teaspoon. It takes a while for you to boil the water to make your cup of tea, but then once it has been boiled, it stays hot for a while. A teaspoon, before you put it in the tea, is stone cold. As soon as you put it in the tea, it takes about 5 seconds for that teaspoon to get too hot for you to touch. But then you take it out, and in about 5 or 10 seconds, it cools down really, really quickly. So the teaspoon is like a large landmass. It's more solid, it therefore cools down much faster, but it heats up much faster too. The cup of tea is like an area surrounded by sea, because water tends to hold onto the heat for longer and take longer to cool down, but also takes longer to warm up in the first place. So if you're an island like the UK surrounded by the sea, we actually get much warmer temperatures in winter than we should do. We are further north than Toronto. London is further north than Toronto, and yet it's about 10 degrees warmer in January than Toronto in Canada is, for that same reason. So that's what I talk about, the Canada versus UK thing. Again, I cover this in the weather hazards and climate change sections. And another global factor is where if you're an area of high mountains, like the Andes mountain range or the Himalayas, areas that are where our mountains, areas forced to rise above those mountains, cools, condenses, and it forms rainfall. So mountainous areas can be incredibly wet areas, but behind the mountain, where the rainfall's kind of already run out, it can be very dry and you can get desert areas. So the Andes mountain range on the west side is generally a lot wetter than on the east side, which has one of the driest deserts in the world in the Atacama Desert. Okay, so these are other global factors, not just latitude and climate, that can affect how ecosystems are found where they're found or why they're found where they're found. Okay, so take as many notes as you would like on that before you move on, please. And I'm just going to move the PowerPoint on. Oh, this just illustrates the rain shadow effect that I was talking about. So where you've got these high mountains, you can go up the one side and it creates this wet windward slope, they call it. But as excuse me, the rain and the moisture runs out, as it descends into the leeward slope, you get a very dry environment, the rain shadow effect. So climate graphs. Now this activity, there's some resources saved on 365 for you to complete this. These climate graphs show varying things, and they are for different ecosystems. So I have left blank specifically what biome each climate graph is for, because what I would like you to do is complete the activities that are listed. They're both on the handout that's available on 365, but also on the screen now. I would like you to cut out all of the climate graphs and use the information from your mind map from last lesson, which gave you specific detail about the temperature and the rainfall you would expect to find in these places over the course of a year, to try and match the correct climate graph to the correct biome. Once you've given it a relevant title, you can then hopefully fit around your world map, which is also saved on 365, the climate graphs, so you can draw lines from the climate graph to the correct biome. Okay, so what you're doing is following these steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, arrange these climate graphs. Once you've figured out where they belong using your mind map from last lesson, just plot them around your world map and then draw a line from the climate graph to where it's found. So if you, for example, felt that this was, okay, well, high temperatures most of the year, pretty much no rain most of the year, I'd expect this is probably quite an easy one to spot. It's a desert. So I would cut out, stick this, right, climate graph for a desert, and then I'd draw a line from this climate graph to a place that I know is a desert area on my color-coded map. Okay, and you do that for the rest of them. If you want a bit of a challenge task, a bit of number crunching is something which the exam would like to do. Try and figure out for each climate graph what the annual rainfall is. You would work that out by adding up, roughly, because you haven't got exact numbers, how much rainfall, so all the little blue bars, how much rainfall that place gets, add them all together for the year. If you want to work out the mean rainfall, you try and add them up and then divide by 12. The rainfall range, biggest minus the smallest, and the temperature range, highest minus the lowest. Okay, so this is just testing your sort of basic geography numeracy skills, which the exam board would like to test at least in one of the papers that you'll cover at the end of year 11. Oh, yeah, a bit of a word of warning. Beware if the axes change. So some of the axes might be 0, 10, 20. Some of them might not be 0, 10, 20. They might be different. So if you look at the rainfall one for this one, it actually goes from 0 to 50 to 100 to 100. So this scale is very different to this one, which goes 0, 10, 20, 30, 40. So you can see, just be mindful of the difference in the scales of the changing axes, and that hopefully will stop you getting caught out. Okay, so once you've covered that, you can then unpause the screen and we'll crack on just to complete the lesson. All right, so these are the answers. The one in the top left here, and you can compare this to your work, top right is the tropical grassland or savanna. Then the top left there is tropical rainforest, desert, temperate deciduous forest, tundra, boreal forest or taiga, and temperate grassland. Okay, so using the data in your mind maps from before, hopefully you match these up to the correct ones. I'll give you a minute, or you can pause the screen just to look and just check that you've got the right place and make any corrections you need to make. Okay, so just to finish this lesson off really, this is a funny looking graph, and it's the graph itself, I'd like you to just have a look at to see if you can interpret the graph, because you might get faced with a funny looking graph in an exam, and I don't want you to be scared of them. So this I know looks like a bit of a weird blob of different kind of shades of green, but what I'd like you to do is just figure out what this graph shows in overall, and see if you can make the link between the type of environment that's there and the graph that's visible. Okay, that will get us to the end of the lesson. This one's been a bit more difficult, a bit more wide-reaching, so thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.